Oak Creek Memorial in Philadelphia smells like antiseptic and burned coffee, fluorescent lights buzzing over beige linoleum in the ER where Natalie Hayes restocks trauma bays at 0600 before anyone arrives. She moves efficiently, checking airway kits with muscle memory, her fingers pausing on an intubation tray before she grips that dog tag through the fabric of her left scrub's pocket. A faint scar runs along her right forearm, visible when she reaches for supplies on high shelves, the kind of scar that tells a story nobody has ever asked her about. The other nurses, Sharon Kim, Jessica Torres, Mike Chen, talk around her, not to her, their conversations dying when she approaches the nurses' station. She's been at Oak Creek for 3 years and 6 months. Nobody knows her first name in the way that matters. They know the quiet one. They know her the nurse who never comes to happy hour. They know the empty chair at the break room table is always the one beside her. At 06:05, Natalie refills the crash cart for stands with methodical precision. 18-gauge needles. 20-gauge needles. Central line kits. Her hands never hesitate. The fluorescent lights flicker overhead, casting a sickly white glow across everything, and she doesn't flinch at the buzz and hum of the electrical current struggling against age. She reaches into her pocket without thinking, touching the dog tag on the broken chain, the way other people touch a cross around their neck or a lucky coin. It's not luck. It's memory. It's a name she's not supposed to have anymore. Major Natalie Hayes, stripped from every database in 2004 after an extraction in Bagram went sideways and 3 senators decided the mission had never happened. The military had erased her completely, reassigned her identity to a pension file marked classified, told her to disappear into civilian life and never surface under penalty of treason. She'd walked out of Walter Reed with a cardboard box and orders that weren't written down. Now she restocks trauma bays in Philadelphia under a first name that technically doesn't exist on any official record from before 2005. Dr. Marcus Caldwell arrives at 0730, expensive shoes clicking on tile, the kind of shoes that cost more than Natalie makes in 2 weeks. His brother is on the hospital board. His father-in-law is the state senator who championed the hospital's last expansion. He arrived at Oak Creek 6 months ago with a plan to become the chief medical officer before he turned 42, and he's identified one primary obstacle: controlled chaos. He needs the emergency department functioning at 87% capacity at all times, profitable but not so efficient that nobody notices how much money is being left on the table. He needs crises to justify budget increases. He needs expansion plans that require administrative oversight, board meetings, consultants. Natalie runs the ER at 94% efficiency. She catches medication errors before they happen. She predicts patient decompensation 3 minutes before monitors catch it. She moves through the department like someone reading a room in a language nobody else speaks. She's a threat to his chaos strategy, and Caldwell has already started building his file. She's standing at the medication dispensary at 0815 when Caldwell walks in with an attending physician named Dr. Reeves. They're discussing the Patterson admission, a 58-year-old male with chest pain and borderline troponin levels. Natalie listens while scanning a unit of blood into the system, her hand steady as surgical lasers, her face neutral. The conversation happens around her like she's furniture. Reeves wants to admit Patterson to cardiac observation. Caldwell wants to send him home with follow-up labs and emergency discharge paperwork, reduce the bed census, increase the outpatient referral numbers, look good on the quarterly report. He prescribes a dose of metoprolol that's 12.5 milligrams higher than what Patterson's creatinine clearance should allow. Natalie's eyes don't move from the blood unit, but her breathing changes, a single measured inhale. At 0847, Patterson is in room 4. His wife is holding his chart, asking questions about the medication. Natalie is adjusting his monitors, checking his foresight. Her hands move with precision, her voice pitched low and level when she speaks, and she makes a statement that will change everything. The metoprolol dose may be contraindicated given his kidney function. The creatinine is 2.1. That's approximately 18 milliliters per minute clearance. She's not asking. She's not suggesting. She's stating medical fact in front of the patient's wife, and there's no way to unsay it. The room goes quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Caldwell's jaw tightens. His left eye narrows, a fracture in his composure that Natalie catches immediately because she spent 23 years reading people under pressure. He steps closer to Patterson's bedside and speaks without addressing Natalie directly. The dosing is appropriate. Continue with the current regimen. Then, quieter, to Patterson's wife, our nursing staff can sometimes misunderstand pharmaceutical calculations. Nothing to worry about. Natalie doesn't respond. She doesn't argue. She doesn't explain. She simply finishes checking the 4-pump, beep, 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 and leaves the room with her face perfectly smooth, perfectly controlled. But her hand finds that dog tag in her pocket again, and she grips it hard enough that the broken chain cuts into her palm. By 0900, Caldwell is in his office drafting a message. By 0915, it's on the unit board printed in 12-point Arial font, laminated and posted directly above the schedule where everyone will see it. The form is official, hospital letterhead, titled Incident Report for Professional Behavior. It cites a tone violation during patient care, specifically, a nurse making statements that undermine physician authority in front of family members. It includes the date, the time, room 4, the patient name. It's dated today and requires her signature, which she'll provide because refusing to sign will only make it worse. Natalie reads it at 0920 while restocking the trauma cart with chest tubes and thoracostomy trays. The words blur slightly, but her face doesn't change. Muscle memory. This is what discipline looks like when you've survived court-martial proceedings that never happened, debriefing sessions at the Pentagon, and a discharge that was officially classified as a medical retirement so nobody would ask questions. An incident report is nothing. An incident report is air. She signs it without comment. By 1100, the break room is noticeably different. Sharon Kim and Jessica Torres are eating lunch, salads in plastic containers, coffee getting cold in paper cups, and when Natalie enters carrying a sandwich wrapped in foil and a bottle of water, the air pressure changes. Not dramatically. Nothing anybody could point to and say, see? That's deliberate. Just a subtle shift. Sharon glances at Jessica. Jessica glances toward the door. I'm going to eat at my desk, Sharon says. Yeah, me too, Jessica agrees, gathering her things with unnecessary speed. Charts to update. They leave within 90 seconds. Mike Chen, sitting across the room reading the sports section, suddenly remembers he needs to check on a patient. The break room is empty except for Natalie, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry wasps, and the sound of her unwrapping the sandwich, plastic crinkling in the silence like thunder. She eats mechanically. Chew. Swallow. Breathe. Repeat. The sandwich tastes like nothing. She's eaten in far worse circumstances, sand in her teeth during desert operations, blood on her hands during field surgery at Bagram, stale MRE rations in the back of a Chinook helicopter heading toward a landing zone that had already been compromised. This is a break room at a civilian hospital in Philadelphia. This is nothing. This is air. But her left hand finds that dog tag again at 11:15, and she holds it while staring at the empty chairs around the break room table, and for exactly 4 seconds, a breach in her composure so small that nobody would notice but herself, something like grief passes across her face before the mask slides back into place. The dog tag is cold. It always is. She releases it at 11:20 and continues eating her sandwich, alone. The sandwich sat untouched on her lap. Natalie pressed the plastic wrap between her fingers, methodical, while the break room emptied around her like a tide going out. Jessica Torres grabbed her coffee mid-sip. Mike Chen suddenly remembered paperwork upstairs. Sharon Kim's eyes went soft with apology before she followed them out. By 11:02 a.m., Natalie was alone with the hum of the fluorescent lights and the weight of the dog tag pressing against her ribs under her scrubs. Through the break room window, Dr. Caldwell stood in the hallway talking with the chief of staff, gesturing toward her with the casual precision of someone planting a flag. His voice carried the kind of authority that didn't need to be loud. The chief of staff nodded. They both glanced toward the window. Natalie didn't look up. She took another bite of her sandwich. The turkey was cold. That was fine. Cold or warm didn't matter anymore. The write-up had appeared on the unit bulletin board that morning, printed on hospital letterhead with her name centered like an indictment: disciplinary notice, Nurse N. Hayes, tone violation, undermining physician authority in patient care setting. She knew the words by heart already. Caldwell had made sure everyone passed it on their way to the supply closet, the medication room, the bathroom. Sharon Kim had read it with wide eyes and hadn't spoken to her since. The younger residents had started using the nickname by afternoon, clipboard. Just like that. Caldwell had introduced it during surgical handoff: clipboard here will handle post-op monitoring. Try not to improvise, clipboard. Scattered laughs. The name stuck like a scar. She was finishing the last bite when the overhead speaker crackled. Incoming trauma. Military ambulance ETA for minutes. Trauma Bay 1 and 2 standing by. The break room cleared in seconds. Natalie wrapped her sandwich, placed the apple back in the Tupperware, and stood. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. The kind of steady that came from having already survived the worst that could happen, and surviving it again, and again, until steady became muscle memory and fear became just another vital sign to monitor. The ambulance bay doors opened at 12:04 p.m., and the noise came first: the mechanical whine of the hydraulic lift, the radios crackling with medical shorthand, boots on wet concrete. Then the stretcher. Then the young man on it. Staff Sergeant Derek Chen, 24 years old, shrapnel wounds from a Kandahar IED, his parents, Mary and Robert Chen, moving alongside the gurney like satellites caught in gravitational orbit. Natalie was already moving toward Trauma Bay 1 when she saw him. The scar was small. 3 inches, curved slightly like a parenthesis, located on the left temple. Field sutures. The kind you do under fire, by flashlight, with your hands shaking so badly you have to grip the needle with both fingers to keep it steady. The kind that leave marks that don't fade, even after 20 years. She knew that scar. The stretcher wheezed as the paramedic transferred him to the hospital bed. 24-year-old male, multiple fragment wounds from IED blast, right leg and torso, significant lacerations, already received 2 units whole blood in the field, vitals currently stable, last pain medication 40 minutes ago. The paramedic's voice was professional, clipped, the voice of someone who had said this same report 100 times and would say it 100 times more. Natalie stepped forward to take his vitals. Her fingers found his pulse, tachycardic but steady. 118 beats per minute. Blood pressure 132/87. Temperature 98.6. The numbers came. The body reported everything, if you listened. She listened. His eyes were closed, sedated, his face slack in that particular way of unconsciousness that made him look younger and older simultaneously. But the scar. The scar was unmistakable. She'd made that scar herself, 20 years ago in a hospital that no longer existed, on a 4-year-old boy whose father had pressed something into her hand before the extraction team pulled her out, a single dog tag on a broken chain, the metal warm from his neck, a weight that had never gotten lighter. Her hand went to her pocket. The dog tag was there, where it always was. She gripped it through the fabric of her scrubs and said nothing. Said nothing while the monitors beeped their introduction to Derek's arrival. Said nothing while his parents were ushered to the waiting area with promises that the doctors would update them soon. Said nothing while the ER transformed around her with the coordinated chaos of a trauma activation, each person moving into their role like dancers who had practiced this same choreography 1,000 times. Dr. Caldwell arrived in Trauma Bay 1 like a force of nature, shoulders back, eyes sharp, that particular swagger of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in every room. He saw Natalie and his jaw tightened. Not with anger. With something colder. With the look of a man watching a pawn try to move like a knight. "Let's get a real assessment here," he said, shouldering past her with a subtle twist of his body that made clear, "You are in the way." Natalie stepped back. She'd learned this dance already. She'd learned it in the break room, in front of the Patterson family, in every glance and every dismissal that had accumulated over the past 72 hours like shrapnel embedding itself deeper. But she also did something else. She listened. Derek's breathing was shallow on the right side. The monitor showed oxygen saturation at 94% and trending down. His heart rate climbing, 128 now. His neck veins slightly distended, more than they should be for someone sedated and stable. The signs were there, written in the language of his body, and Natalie read them like scripture. "Dr. Caldwell," she said quietly, her voice pitched low so only he could hear. "I'm concerned about developing tension pneumothorax. His trachea is deviating and his breath sounds on the right R." Clipboard. His voice cut through hers like a blade. He didn't turn around. "Please. This is combat trauma, not a nursing textbook. His vitals are stable. Stick to vitals and let me handle diagnostics. You're out of your depth." Mary Chen, Derek's mother, was standing in the bay doorway. She'd followed them in, drawn by the gravity of her son's injury, and her face shifted at Caldwell's words, a small movement of the eyebrows, a narrowing of the mouth. The look of someone watching their child's care be handled by a man who'd just told the other woman in the room she was stupid without saying the word directly. Natalie took one measured breath. She felt the heat rise behind her eyes, not fear, not anger, something else entirely. Something that felt like grief and rage compressed into a single point. She let one tear escape without flinching, without looking away, and wiped it with the back of her hand while maintaining eye contact with Caldwell. Her voice came out soft, almost apologetic. "You're right, doctor," she said. "I wouldn't want to overstep my limited experience." The words landed exactly as intended. Caldwell's shoulders relaxed slightly. He'd won. He'd taken her down in front of a patient's family and she'd accepted it. He was already moving away, already issuing orders for standard monitoring protocols and imaging studies, already turning his attention to the next thing that demanded his expertise. But Natalie stayed close to the bed. She watched the monitors because that's what she did. She watched the O2 sat dropping, 94 to 92 to 90. She watched the heart rate climbing, 132 now, 138. She watched the neck veins getting more distended, the breathing more labored, the body's slow and accelerating descent toward crisis. And she waited. What happened next didn't just change everything. It changed everything that came after. The next 6 hours were a masterclass in how not to treat a pneumothorax. Caldwell ordered standard monitoring, saw the vitals stabilize briefly around 2 p.m., and stepped away convinced he'd been right. Natalie watched the downward curve resume around 3:36 p.m. She said nothing. She'd learned her lesson about speaking. But she stayed close, and she prepared. She gathered supplies. She reviewed Derek's chart again, looking for the notes from Kandahar, from the field medics who'd triaged him initially, from anyone who might have documented what she already knew. The trauma surgeon on call, a woman named Dr. Reeves with silver streaking her hair and eyes that had seen things, caught Natalie's arm in the hallway at 4:33 p.m. "You look like you know something," Dr. Reeves said. "Not a question." "Tension pneumothorax," Natalie said. "Developing slow. The signs are subtle but they're there. Vitals look stable because the body's compensating, but the pressure's building. When it decompensates, it'll happen fast." Dr. Reeves studied her for 3 seconds. "You trained?" "A long time ago," Natalie said. "In a different life. The best nurses are the ones who've already seen the worst and remember it," Dr. Reeves said. She was already moving back toward the trauma bay. "Stay close to him. Call me the second anything changes." The monitor alarm sounded at 6:12 p.m. Oxygen saturation 76. Heart rate 156. Systolic blood pressure dropping like a stone, 128, 119, 104. The room filled with voices, with motion, with the particular urgency of a body in its final moments of compensation before complete decompensation. Caldwell was in the cafeteria. The trauma team was scattered. Dr. Reeves came in from the trauma call room, moving with controlled speed, and Natalie was already there with the needle, already reading the trajectory of Derek's collapse like someone who'd read it 100 times before. Needle decompression, Dr. Reeves said. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Do it now. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaped. The monitors responded like a held breath finally released. O2 sat climbing, 78, 82, 88, 92. Sinus rhythm. Pressure normalizing. The body remembering how to survive. Derek opened his eyes for the first time since arrival. His mother, who'd been waiting in the family area, would never know that she'd almost lost him. Caldwell, in the cafeteria, would never know how close the margin had been. But Natalie knew. And Derek, through the fog of sedation and pain, looked directly at her, and something in his expression shifted, a moment of recognition or gratitude, or maybe just the basic human acknowledgement that someone had seen him, had known he needed help, and had given it anyway despite every reason not to. She didn't break eye contact. She didn't smile. She just nodded once and stepped back to let the rest of the team work. That night, at 11:48 p.m., she sat in the break room again. The sandwich was gone. The apple was gone. Just her and the fluorescent lights and the dog tag in her pocket, heavier now somehow, weighted with something she didn't have words for yet. The trauma surgery had taken 4 hours. Thoracotomy, chest tube placement, repair of a partially severed pulmonary artery that Caldwell's standard monitoring would have missed until it was too late. Derek was in ICU recovery. Stable. Alive. The kind of alive that only existed because someone had known to look for the danger that others couldn't see. Natalie's phone buzzed at 12:03 a.m. A text from Sharon Kim, "Did you save that soldier?" She didn't answer. But she gripped that dog tag, that weight, that memory, that proof that she was more than a quiet woman in scrubs who knew how to take blood pressure and follow orders, and felt something in her chest shift, like a locked door beginning to open. 12 minutes after Derek Chen's admission, the monitor started singing a different song. The beeping changed pitch. Higher. Faster. His oxygen saturation had been 96% 15 minutes ago. Now it read 71 and dropping. The numbers fell like a stone through dark water, 68, 65, 62. His blood pressure crashed from 118 to 84 in the span of a breath. Natalie felt it before she saw it, the way her body recognized the pattern from 2 decades of field work, tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, compressing the lung, crushing the heart. The warning she'd given Caldwell. The one he'd erased from the chart with 3 lines of pen. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. Sharon Kim's voice split through the unit like a siren. The crash cart was already moving. Hands grabbing the defibrillator, someone calling for the charge, someone else, Jessica Torres, bagging Derek's face while his chest remained still as stone. The ventilator hissed. The monitors screamed. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, indifferent to the chaos unfolding beneath them. Natalie moved toward the bay. Not running. Walking. The composure she'd learned in Bagram, where panic killed faster than bullets, kept her stride even, her breathing controlled. In her scrubs pocket, the dog tag pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Dr. Caldwell rushed in, his face already pale. He'd been at the nursing station, reviewing the chart that Natalie had written at Derek's bedside an hour ago, noting the increased respiratory effort, the subtle asymmetry of breath sounds, the telltale signs of pressure building behind the sternum. He pushed through to the bedside and then stopped. His hands hovered over the decompression kit on the crash cart. Protocol locked. In that moment, he was not a director with political ambitions and a brother on the board. He was a man watching a patient die and unable to move. "Get the crash cart!" Caldwell shouted, as if the crash cart wasn't already there. "Someone bag him. Someone get an airway." But there was no airway to get. Derek's chest wasn't rising. The air trapped in his thoracic cavity was doing what pressure does, crushing, compressing, killing. His heart rate climbed to 142, then 160. His blood pressure bottomed out at 60/30. The monitor's rhythm fractured into something irregular, something losing its way. Natalie had seen this rhythm exactly 4 times in her career. 3 of those patients died. She moved to the crash cart without asking. Without waiting. Her hands knew what to do before her mind had finished speaking. The MRE packets were still in Derek's personal effects bag, sitting on the metal table beside the trauma bed, 3 olive drab vacuum-sealed meal packets. Ranger rations. The same ration she'd carried through the Hindu Kush. She grabbed one, ripped it open with her teeth, pulled the inner vacuum-sealed pouch free, and tore it flat. For seconds. That was all the silence allowed. "What are you doing?" Caldwell's voice, confused. Panicked. The voice of someone watching competence move at a speed beyond his understanding. Natalie didn't answer. She'd learned long ago that explanation was a luxury that dying people couldn't afford. She marked the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmark burned into her muscle memory from trauma surgery at Bagram, from the 4-year-old boy on a stretcher with shrapnel in his chest, from the moment she'd understood that healing sometimes meant acting with precision and no permission. She grabbed the 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart, felt the familiar weight of it, and moved with the terrifying fluid grace of someone who had done this exact procedure in a tent without electricity or anesthesia. The needle entered at the angle her hands remembered. Air hissed out, a sound like escape, like pressure releasing, like life choosing to stay. The monitor steadied. Derek's oxygen saturation climbed, 75, 82, 88. She pressed the flattened MRE pouch over the wound, securing it with 3 pieces of trauma tape she pulled from the kit, creating the seal that would keep air out and pressure in. Sinus rhythm. Clear and true. His heart recognized that the danger had passed. His body, recognizing the same ancient truth that warriors learn, when someone moves with that kind of certainty, you trust them with your life. Sharon Kim stared. Jessica Torres whispered something, "Oh my God," or maybe just a prayer in the shape of words. Mary Chen, Derek's mother, gripped her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles went white, but her eye stayed on Natalie, on the quiet woman in the blue scrubs who'd just pulled her son back from the edge. Derek's eyes fluttered open. Confused. Alive. The ventilator breathed for him in perfect, steady rhythm. Caldwell recovered his composure the way he recovered everything, by erasing what had just happened and replacing it with his own version of the story. He stepped forward, loud enough for the entire code team to hear, loud enough to establish himself as the directing force even though he'd been frozen like a photograph, like a man made of stone. Good response time, everyone. Textbook code management. Let's get him stabilized and transferred to ICU. Natalie, you can step back now. He didn't acknowledge her. Didn't look at her. Didn't say the word that would have cost him nothing, thank you. She stepped back. Her hands were finally shaking. That night, alone in her car in the Oak Creek parking lot, rain hammering the windshield like applause, Natalie gripped the dog tag through her scrub fabric and felt the metal warm from her body heat. The weight of it. The memory of it. The impossible coincidence of Derek's scar, Derek's presence in her ER, Derek alive because she'd warned about something Caldwell refused to hear. In Bagram, she'd been Major Natalie Hayes. She'd had authority. She'd had a rank that meant something. Here, at Oak Creek Memorial in Philadelphia, she was just the quiet nurse. The one who knew how to take blood pressure and follow orders. The one who'd been marked with a disciplinary notice and fed to the break room wolves. But she'd just saved a soldier's life. She'd just performed emergency trauma medicine in front of a team that now knew, with absolute certainty, that she was more than what Caldwell had written in his incident report. Dr. Caldwell knew it too. That was the dangerous part. He began his escalation that same night. No explosion of rage. No dramatic confrontation. Something more effective. Something systemic. He called the chief of staff at home, a man who owed Caldwell favors, who'd moved through the hospital hierarchy with Caldwell's help, who understood how silence could be purchased, and calmly requested a formal performance review. Due to concerning judgment patterns, he said, "I want to make sure we're not missing something significant with her clinical decision-making." Professional language. Institutional cover. A mechanism that moved through the system like machinery, grinding slow but inevitable. The next morning, the master schedule appeared on the unit board with new assignments. Natalie, who'd been working days with the senior trauma nurses, was reassigned to night shift. Not as punishment, that would leave marks, create evidence. As appropriate resource allocation. Night shift with Jessica Torres and 2 new graduate nurses who'd been on the floor for less than 3 months. Junior staff. Inexperienced. The kind of team that would make any intervention questionable, any clinical decision subject to interpretation. By Wednesday, a memo appeared in her mailbox, authored by Caldwell and CSIT to HR, Scope Limitation Notice. Due to recent performance assessments, RN Hayes' clinical responsibilities have been adjusted to ensure appropriate skill level alignment. Patient care assignments will be limited to low acuity cases. Critical patient access requires direct supervisor approval. Translation: she was being caged. Removed from the trauma patients. From the meaningful work. From the place where her competence was undeniable. But that wasn't the worst part. The real mechanism was already in motion. That same Wednesday, Caldwell began building the termination file. A document here. A flagged note there. Each entry dated. Each copy filed with HR. A performance review form, already half-filled, already suggesting significant concerns regarding clinical judgment and scope awareness. He worked with the precision of someone who'd done this before, who understood that the best way to erase someone wasn't with a single blow, but with 1,000 small administrative cuts that bled the person out slowly, gave them no single moment to fight back against, turned the entire institution into the mechanism of their removal. Natalie sat in her car in the hospital parking lot and understood, with the clarity of someone trained to read tactics and terrain, that this was war. Not the kind with weapons. The kind with paperwork. With boards and bureaucracy. With allies like the chief of staff who owed favors and committees that moved at the speed of institutional inertia. She'd survived combat in the mountains of Afghanistan. She'd survived being erased from every military database. She'd rebuilt a life from nothing in a hospital that didn't know who she was. She could survive this too. Even though she already knew how it would end. Even though she could see the timeline unfolding, the performance review, the restrictions, the gradual isolation, the moment when she'd be called into an office and told that her services were no longer needed, that they decided to go in a different direction, that the decision had nothing to do with her competence and everything to do with fit. She'd survived worse. She knew how to disappear. That was what the military had taught her, how to become invisible. How to erase yourself before anyone else could do it for you. But Derek Chen was upstairs in the ICU, breathing with the ventilator, the scar on his temple a reminder that some things were worth staying visible for. Some people were worth the risk. She gripped the dog tag and waited for what would come next. The shift schedules changed overnight. Natalie noticed the printout on the break room bulletin board, laminated, color-coded, Dr. Caldwell's signature at the bottom. She was moved from the trauma rotation to night shifts, partnered exclusively with residents fresh out of medical school, their confidence exceeding their competence by a dangerous margin. The experienced nurses, Sharon Kim, Marcus Webb, the ones who'd watched her work, were assigned to opposite rotations. She passed them in hallways now like ships changing course. Nobody said anything. That was worse. 2 days later, another memo. Effective immediately, Natalie's patient assignments were restricted to the low acuity zones, the stable post-op floors, the observation wing, the patients with simple problems that required no rail thinking. Critical patients were reassigned before she could see their charts. She watched from the nurse's station as a 17-year-old with acute compartment syndrome got fast-tracked to surgery under Dr. Caldwell's direct care, the kind of case that demanded immediate fasciotomy or the kid lost his leg. She could have saved 90 minutes of surgical time with proper assessment. She said nothing. The Chief of Staff's office called 3 days after that. Performance review. Mandatory. The next morning she sat across from a panel of 5 people who didn't meet her eyes. They had documentation now, a complaint from a resident about her tone during rounds, a notation that she'd questioned a treatment protocol, a supervisor's observation that she seemed disengaged from team collaboration. All of it technically accurate. All of it weaponized. Caldwell had built his case with the precision of a man who understood institutional machinery the way a sniper understands wind correction, calculate everything, adjust for variables, pull the trigger when conditions aligned. Your employment status is under review pending further investigation, the Chief of Staff said, scanning the file like it might bite him. Natalie understood what was happening. She'd seen it before, in a different context, in a different country. The slow systematic removal of your ability to operate. First access, then authority, then credibility, then employment. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. She'd spent 7 years perfecting the art of extraction under fire, and now she was being extracted by form letters and bureaucratic procedure. 2 weeks passed. 14 days of working shifts where nothing critical came across her assignment screen, 14 days of watching Dr. Caldwell move through the hospital like he owned it, 14 days of storing her things piece by piece in her locker because she already knew how this ended. She'd seen it happen before, just on a different scale. In Bagram, when the mission went sideways and 3 senators decided it had never happened at all, they'd erased her the same way, paperwork first, then the official denial, then the silence. The rain started around 1,600 hours on a Tuesday, fat drops that hammered the Philadelphia asphalt like bullets from a distant gun. Natalie stood at the bus stop on Broad Street with a cardboard box in her arms, the kind you'd get from moving, and inside it were the accumulated pieces of a life she was supposed to be living. A mug with "World's Okayest Nurse" printed on ceramic that was already cracking, the fading letters starting to disappear like she was disappearing. A succulent with brown leaves curling inward, dying from neglect because she couldn't even keep a plant alive during 12-hour shifts. And a photograph, faded at the edges, of 8 soldiers in desert fatigue standing in front of a mud brick compound in Helmand Province. All of them looked like kids. All of them were dead according to official records, training casualties, the file said, though training casualties didn't usually happen during Black Ops extractions where 3 senators voted to deny the operation existed. Her phone buzzed at 1,643 hours. Unknown number. She answered without hope. Ms. Hayes. A woman's voice, apologetic in that way that meant bad news was coming. This is Dr. Caldwell's office. I'm calling to notify you that your performance review was concluded this morning. Dr. Caldwell has requested that you do not return to Oak Creek Memorial for your next scheduled shift. Your final paycheck will be mailed to your home address. Natalie didn't respond. There was nothing to respond to. She'd known for days. The box got heavier in the rain. Is there anything I can? No, Natalie said, and ended the call. The bus stop's plastic shelter did nothing against water that seemed determined to find every exposed surface. She set the box down on the bench and it immediately started absorbing moisture from below, the cardboard going soft. Her coat clung to her ribs. The dog tag in her scrubs pocket felt heavier than it should have, just 2 inches of metal but somehow containing the weight of 20 years of silence, of Derek Chen still recovering on the 4th floor of the hospital that had just fired her, of 3 senators and classified operations and orders that never officially existed. She thought about walking back in. Just once more, riding the elevator to the 4th floor, checking on Derek, making sure his chest X-ray showed full expansion, that his oxygen saturation was holding stable without supplemental. She'd saved him twice, once as a 4-year-old in a surgical tent with incoming fire, and once in the trauma bay when his own body had tried to kill him. He didn't know it was the same person. He didn't know that the quiet nurse who questioned protocols and accepted insults in silence was the same woman who'd led combat medical operations across Helmand Province, who'd walked into a warlord's compound with nothing but a voice and a refusal to leave soldiers behind. Orders were orders. Even when they were destroying you. A bus pulled up, number 7, heading east. The doors hissed open. She picked up the wet box and stepped toward it, her boots still moving like they'd been trained to move, one foot in front of the other, no hesitation, no looking back. But something caught. Some thread of her that hadn't fully accepted erasure yet. She stood in the bus doorway for 11 seconds, rain running down her face, water mixing with something that might have been tears but that she wouldn't acknowledge. Through the wet window of the shelter, she could see Oak Creek Memorial's lights, the tower glowing amber against grey sky. Derek was in there. His mother was in there. Sharon Kim was in there. And Dr. Caldwell was in there, moving through corridors that should have been teaching him something about consequences but probably weren't. "You getting on?" the bus driver asked. Natalie stepped up and the doors closed behind her. She moved to the back of the bus, the box dripping onto the floor, and watched the hospital disappear into rain and distance. The fluorescent lights of the bus hummed with a sound like helicopter rotors if you didn't listen too carefully, if you let yourself hear what you wanted to hear instead of what was actually there. She'd vanished before. In Bagram, after the extraction, they'd erased Major Natalie Hayes from every database, told her to disappear into civilian life, warned her that surfacing would mean treason charges because the mission had officially never happened. She'd done exactly what they ordered. Changed her name on paper, just Natalie, no rank, no history. Found a job at a hospital. Kept her head down. Said nothing. But hiding had never made her invisible. And on a grey Tuesday morning 72 hours later, when a 250-pound man named Vincent Darrow stormed into Oak Creek Memorial's ER hallway with a .45 caliber handgun and everyone else ran, something in the rain-soaked silence of that bus would shift. Not yet. But soon. Because the quietest person in any room is always the most dangerous one. The world just has to catch up to that understanding. The bus rolled deeper into the city, carrying her away from the hospital and toward something she didn't know yet but which was already moving toward her, inevitable as physics, relentless as gravity, a staff sergeant with a childhood scar and a memory that wouldn't stay buried, a SEAL team with orders from the Pentagon, and a reckoning that nobody, especially not Dr. Caldwell, saw coming. 72 hours after the cardboard box and the rainy bus stop, on a grey Tuesday morning that smelled like ozone and rain-soaked asphalt, Vincent Darrow walked through the Oak Creek Memorial ER doors carrying a 9mm Glock and 6 weeks of untreated psychosis. 250 pounds of muscle and chaos. Off his antipsychotic since mid-April. For previous admissions to psychiatric hold. 2 restraining orders filed by his ex-wife. And this morning, a voice in his head that screamed that the ER doctors had implanted a tracking device in his molars during his last visit, that they were monitoring his thoughts, that the only solution was to make them stop by making them silent forever. He fired the first shot at 7:38 a.m. into the ceiling of the waiting room. The sound was a crack of thunder in an enclosed space, sharp, absolute, echoing off tile and fluorescent lights that suddenly seemed impossibly bright. Plaster dust fell like snow. The waiting room erupted into motion. Parents grabbed children. An elderly man with chest pain abandoned his clipboard and ran toward the parking lot. A teenage girl screamed. Security Officer Devon Matthews, 62 years old with a bum left knee from a high school football injury, took one look at the weapon, made a rational calculation about ballistics and survival, and sprinted for the back hallway. Everyone ran. Everyone scattered like organisms fleeing a predator. Everyone except Natalie Hayes. She was at the medication dispensary on the east side of the trauma pod, restocking supplies on her 3rd consecutive shift because the agency had called that morning with a desperation in their voice that meant someone had cancelled, probably someone smarter than her, someone who was already home. She'd almost said no. Almost. But the money was $38 an hour and she had exactly $14 in her checking account and rent was due in 9 days, so Natalie had put on the scrubs and clipped the broken dog tag around her neck where she'd kept it for 20 years, and she'd come back to this hospital like a ghost returning to a place of unfinished business. When the shot cracked across the ER, she didn't flinch. She didn't look up. She continued counting gauze packages, 4, 5, 6, and then she closed the dispensary drawer with a soft click and turned toward the sound because silence that follows violence is never really silence, it's the absence of breath, the held moment before something worse happens, and her body had learned long ago to move toward absent breath rather than away from it. Vincent Darrow stood in the center of the waiting room 20 meters from the trauma bay, sweat beading his forehead, the Glock trembling in his right hand because guns were heavier when they were actually loaded, when they actually meant something, when the weight of intention pressed down on your wrist like guilt made physical. His eyes were scanning, looking for the doctors, the ones with the devices, the ones who were watching him from inside his own skull. His pupils were dilated. His chest heaved. He was hyperventilating, panic response, adrenaline spike, the weapon becoming heavier with each breath. Natalie walked toward him. Not ran. Walked. Hands visible at her sides, palms forward, fingers spread. Movement deliberate and slow, the way you approach a spooked horse or a cornered animal, predator energy contained, non-threatening architecture, every muscle synchronized to say I am not a threat, even though her hands could disarm him in 4 seconds and her voice could put a warlord in a trance and her eyes had seen things that would make Vincent Darrow's worst hallucinations look like children's television. Vincent, she said, and her voice was something ancient and steady, the voice of someone who had spoken in the dark, in the dust, in the spaces between life and death. Vincent, my name is Natalie. I'm a nurse. I'm unarmed. Every word was a hook cast into turbulent water. Every syllable was a lifeline. The voice that had negotiated the release of 4 American soldiers from a Taliban commander by using only words and respect and the kind of presence that made the air pressure change was now deployed against a man whose brain chemistry had turned against him, against a man whose molecules were screaming and whose hands shook with the weight of intention. They put devices in my teeth, Vincent said, and his voice cracked like a boy's. Can you feel it? It's here. It's watching. It won't stop watching. I believe you, Natalie said, still advancing, hands still visible, eyes locked with his. The devices are very real to you. And that takes courage to carry. To live with that. I understand courage. She was 6 meters away. 5. The gun's barrel was tracking toward her now, which meant his attention was singular, which meant his nervous system was focused, which meant the panicked scatter response was crystallizing into something worse, active threat targeting. His finger was on the trigger. The safety was off. The round in the chamber was waiting to teach him about physics and momentum and the irreversible mathematics of lead traveling at 400 meters per second. You don't understand, Vincent said, and tears were running down his face now, which meant the panic was metabolizing into despair, which meant the window was closing. Nobody understands. They won't stop. They'll never stop. I understand that they won't stop, Natalie said. She was 3 meters away. Close enough to see the whites of his eyes, the tremor in his hands, the molecule-deep exhaustion of someone living inside a hallucination. And I understand that living with that is intolerable. And I understand that you're trying to make it stop by making them stop. But that won't work, Vincent. The devices aren't in your teeth. The voices aren't coming from outside. And killing me won't silence them. He raised the gun to center mass on her chest. The muzzle was steady now. That was bad, that was the worst possible indicator, because shaking hands sometimes miss and steady hands never do. Then nothing will help, he said. Something will help, Natalie said, and she took the final step, closing the distance to 1 meter, which was the compression point, which was the kill zone and also the only place from which she could take the gun without letting him fire. Medicine will help. Haloperidol will help. Time will help. I will help. She was close enough now to see the medication stains on his shirt, to smell the salt sweat panic on his skin, to count the exact number of tremors in his gun hand per second. She was close enough to take him. Her right hand moved like water and light and something that didn't have a name in civilian medicine. It was a motion taught by people whose job descriptions included the word lethal. It was a wrist lock, a precision application of leverage and anatomy that depended on the specific angle of the radius bone and the specific pressure applied at the exact right moment. It depended on understanding that human joints were hinges and that hinges had limits and that Vincent Darrow's wrist had a breaking point just like every wrist had a breaking point. For seconds. That's all it took. The gun clattered to the tile floor. The sound was a bell's echo. Vincent's radius fractured with a crack that was both soft and absolute. His scream came after the break, which meant his brain had registered the threat to his structural integrity before it registered the pain. He went to his knees. The gun slid across the floor toward the waiting room and came to rest against a discarded magazine. Natalie stood above him with her hand still visible, posture unchanged, breathing unchanged, as if she had simply guided him to the ground the way she might guide a patient from a stretcher to a bed. "You're going to be okay," she said quietly. "Your wrist is fractured. We're going to immobilize it. The pain will decrease over time. The voices won't, not immediately, but the haloperidol will make them quieter. 12 to 18 hours. You'll notice the difference." Security was moving now, coming back from the hallway, 2 officers in dark uniforms with radios crackling urgent language into the empty air. Someone was calling 911. Someone was calling the police. The waiting room was bleeding back into the ER like a wound reopening, people emerging from the back hallway where they'd fled, phones raised, eyes wide, witnessing a thing they didn't understand. That was when Staff Sergeant Derek Chen came down from the 4th floor on crutches. He'd heard the shot. Had heard the scream. And he'd done what soldiers do, he'd ignored the pain in his abdomen where Natalie's improvised chest seal had saved him 72 hours earlier, and he'd moved toward the sound because that's what you do when people are screaming, that's the job, that's the unwritten contract between those who can help and those who can't. He came around the corner on crutches, still weak, still healing, still carrying the weight of shrapnel that was slowly being absorbed into his body where the surgeons couldn't reach it, and he saw Natalie standing over Vincent Darrow with her hand still visible and the gun on the floor 10 meters away, and he understood immediately what had happened because he'd watched her work with the medic crew in Kandahar and he'd seen her move the same way, with that same compressed efficiency, as if violence and mercy were just 2 points on the same spectrum. "Major," he said. His voice was loud. It carried through the ER like a command, rank, title, acknowledgement, testimony. The room went silent. The kind of silence that comes before something breaks or shifts or reorganizes itself fundamentally. Every staff member within earshot froze. Every eye turned from Vincent Darrow to Natalie Hayes. "Staff Sergeant," Natalie said quietly, addressing him without looking away from the injured man at her feet, which was the exact wrong move for a nurse at an active scene but the exact right move for an officer managing personnel in crisis. Sharon Kim, head nurse, charge nurse, the one person at Oak Creek who'd never abandoned Natalie in the break room, the one person who'd kept a small chair at her table during lunch, stepped forward slowly. She'd heard the rank. She'd heard the deference in Derek's voice. And she had a sealed envelope in her desk that she'd discovered 3 hours earlier while cleaning up after the night shift, an envelope that had fallen behind the old filing cabinet, an envelope marked personnel file, medical leave, classified, and her hands had trembled as she'd opened it because some documents change you just by being in the same room with them. The document was from the Department of Defense. The subject line was 3 words, Major Natalie Hayes. It listed operations: Bagram, Kandahar, FOB Shank. It listed classifications: Top Secret SCI Compartmentalized Access Only. It listed decorations that didn't have names that people like Sharon Kim got to see, operations that didn't have timelines, soldiers who didn't have faces in public documents. Sharon opened the file and began to read aloud, her voice shaking with the weight of revelation. Bronze Star with Valor, she said. 2 Purple Hearts. Her voice cracked. 2 Silver Stars. The ER was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Within 30 minutes, a Black Hawk helicopter descended on the Philadelphia skyline like judgment. It settled on the roof of Oak Creek Memorial with the deliberate precision of something that had done this 100 times in 100 different places. Navy SEAL Commander Briggs descended with 2 other operators, all 3 moving through the ER hallway with the kind of presence that made civilians instinctively step back. They were weaponless. They were dressed in civilian clothes. And they carried authority that transcended the normal hierarchy of civilian institutions. Commander Briggs found Natalie in the holding area where Vincent Darrow was being sedated and treated for his fractured radius. Major Hayes, Briggs said, And it wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact, a recognition, a resurrection of an identity that the Pentagon had officially erased 2 decades earlier. "Commander," she said, and when she spoke his title, her voice shifted, dropped half an octave, took on the acoustic property of someone giving orders rather than receiving them. Briggs turned to the assembled staff and hospital administrators who had gathered, drawn by the presence of the helicopter and the Black Hawk and the unmistakable weight of classified authority descending on their civilian institution. Dr. Caldwell was there. He was frozen in the back of the gathering, face pale, understanding beginning to crystallize in his expression like a drink turning to ice. "This is Major Natalie Hayes," Commander Briggs said. She served 12 years in JSOC Task Force 141. She conducted 17 high-value target extractions in Kandahar. She trained the 75th Ranger Regiment in combat casualty care. And she is being publicly recognized today for her service, her sacrifice, and her character. He recited her medals one by one, each a sentence, each a revelation. "Bronze Star with Valor," Briggs said. The room was absolute silence. "Silver Star," he continued. "Second Silver Star," he said, and someone gasped. "Purple Heart. Second Purple Heart." He paused. The final decoration was the kind of thing that changed careers, that closed doors and opened others, that marked you forever as belonging to an operational world that most people would never access. "And Navy Cross," Commander Briggs said quietly, "for extraordinary heroism in combat." The room didn't just go silent. The room inverted. The architecture of authority shifted. Every pair of eyes that had watched Natalie take verbal abuse, that had witnessed her fired via telephone call while holding a cardboard box in the rain, that had seen her as a quiet nurse who kept to herself, suddenly understood that they'd been standing next to a legend, that they'd been occupying the same space with someone who'd carried the weight of classified operations, that they'd judged a woman without knowing the barest fraction of her story. Dr. Caldwell's face went white. Then red. Then the color of something dying. His hand started to shake. He turned to leave and found 2 uniformed officers from the Philadelphia Police Department standing in the doorway. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They simply existed in the space between Caldwell and the hallway, making it clear that leaving wasn't an option that was being offered. "Dr. Caldwell," one of the officers said, "we need to ask you some questions about evidence tampering and obstruction of justice." It wasn't a request. It was a command. The words had the weight of federal authority behind them. Natalie watched him be led away, and she didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She didn't let a single muscle move in her face. She simply returned to Vincent Darrow's bedside and continued his treatment with the same precision and compassion she'd been offering since he'd arrived at Oak Creek Memorial, because the work was the work, and the work didn't care about vindication or recognition or whether the person doing it had military medals or a security clearance that would take an act of Congress to revoke. But later, when Sharon Kim embraced her in the break room and Derek Chen called her Major one more time and Commander Briggs told her that there was a position at JSOC headquarters waiting for her signature, Natalie reached into her scrubs pocket and held the broken dog tag chain, the one she'd kept for 20 years, the one that had survived every clearance revocation and identity erasure and systematic humiliation. And she understood that some versions of yourself can be erased by governments and institutions and ambitious men in expensive suits, but the version that walks toward violence instead of away from it, the version that disarms armed men with 4 seconds of precise technique, the version that saves children on the other side of the world and staff sergeants in Philadelphia ER bays, that version can never be fully erased. It can only be hidden. And hiding, she'd learned, was a temporary strategy. The Pentagon had been wrong when they told her to disappear. Dr. Caldwell had been catastrophically wrong when he'd tried to erase her a second time. Because Natalie Hayes had learned long ago that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. And on a grey Tuesday morning in Philadelphia, she'd walked toward a man with a gun and proven it to everyone watching. If you made it this far, you understand that the people we underestimate are often the ones we should respect most. Subscribe for more stories about the ones who walk toward danger when everyone else is running. And if you've ever been judged by someone who didn't know your real story, like this video and tell me in the comments, because that's how we build a community of people who look deeper than uniforms and titles and cardboard boxes in the rain. You can be heroic in silence. You can be transformative without being seen. And the world needs more of that. More of you.